Thank you very much. Really exciting to be here. As I was introduced, my name is Liora Braunstein, and for the last 5 years, I've been leading the data science activity at a startup company dealing in the API security domain called Envision, which was recently acquired by Intuit. And I will present to you today how we used NLP methods to find anomalies in API data. So APIs are actually all around us. We're just not thinking about it. We're constantly using them when we're ordering food home and when we're ordering taxi rides. We constantly use them in our professional life as well, as they enable many, many services in the organizations we work at. But at the same time, we don't take into account the risk that they may impose on us, either as private users or on the organizations we work at. And before we dive into, let's just state out what is an API. So an API, an application protocol interface. And there are three main entities that are needed to take into account when we're talking about API world. So we have the publisher, which is the one that develops and exposes the API for others to use it. We have the consumer, which is an application that consumes the API in its own specific manner in order to fulfill some service, some functionality. And we have the end user that indirectly uses the API via the application. Now, I'm sure that all of you, just like me, are using some sort of food ordering application on a nearly regular basis. And I'm also sure and hoping actually that none of you have ever tried to hack that application in order to order the food for free. Let's go over a brief example of how someone was able to do that. Specifically in a Dominos Pizza application in the UK. You can Google it up afterwards for your own curiosity. And this is a simplified scenario. What does it mean to order a pizza in an application? So specifically in that scenario, when someone makes an order via the application, what actually goes under the hood are two transactions. Let's call the first one payment transaction, which in the request that comes to the server side actually contains the payment details. So for example, credit card details. And assuming that everything is okay, the server responds with a transaction with a response that actually contains two interesting fields. One is the status field, which assuming that everything is okay, contains the value of accept, and a payment identifier. Then the following transaction, let's label it as order, actually takes that specific payment identifier. And once again, assuming normal behavior, order is completed, successful, and after a 30-minute time window, you hope to get your pizza. And what a security researcher found, once again, in the Dominos Pizza application in the UK, was that by intercepting the API in an external tool, he can actually abuse the API to order a free pizza. So what he did was actually transmit the payment transaction with erroneous credit card details, received back indeed a status of failure, but also the payment identifier, and subsequently used that specific identifier to his surprise, successfully order a pizza. And got free pizza after 30 minutes. Now what this example actually showcases to us is assuming everything is okay and under normal behavior usages, the API data actually reflects different data patterns and dependencies that underlie and actually reflect the business logic as it comes about in the API data, the business logic of the service that you are using, that you are trying to make use of. And these exact data dependencies are, from an API security perspective, are interesting to capture and in real time monitor because they can reflect deviations in those data patterns, can reflect anomalies that, for example, may imply on abusive usage of the API. So a bit more concretely, we're talking about REST APIs, so we're talking about JSON structures. A transaction is actually a packet corresponding from a request and a response, a request which is being sent to the server. The server replies with a response. Each such component is actually comprised of the different fields. Each field has a name and has a value, depending on the data that it receives. And what we're interested in is finding dependencies between the different data objects. So for example, finding dependencies between different fields, for example, fields that co-occur together in a specific context, or for example, fields that share the same value. But we also want to go beyond the single transaction scope, and we want to go and look for dependencies across transactions, for example, in the pizza use case. And a bit more generally, given a stream of transactions, and if we can label it for a specific user flow, so a user flow transactions, what we want to do is we find the business reflecting data patterns or dependencies between the different data objects in the API data and monitor them. But what's important to us, since explainability is important to us, we also have a predefined set of relations that we are specifically interested, and this is a non-exhaustive list of the types of the relations that we're interested. So, as I've said before, we're interested in finding fields that jointly occur in a specific, either inside a specific transaction or across transactions. We're interested in finding fields that share the same value. We're interested in finding fields that change their value together across transactions. And this change can come from something that we may observe in the API data or not. We don't know. And as I've said, what's interesting in here is understanding that a violation in either of those relations can give rise to an anomaly or a sort of attack that takes place in the API plane. And there are two challenges we need to deal with. Ta-da. Two challenges we need to deal with. First of all, we're talking about a numerous amount of combinations we need to check, because we're talking about pairs or triplets or n-grams of combinations across transactions. And in the security domain, we're really interested in reducing the false positives. So we really want to focus on the business logic reflecting patterns. And one of the approaches that we took at iMvision was to represent the API data as a language. So we create a collection of documents, or a corpus of documents per consumer, per application that we see in the data. Each document represents a specific user's data. We take all the transactions of that user and sort it over time. Each such row or sentence is comprised of the corresponding fields and their values that were in the data. And we can have different setups. We can use a word to be only the field name or only the key. We can use a word to be also a concatenation of the key and the actual value. And if we use word embedding methods on this sort of data, and specifically word2vec from the GenSim package, and more specifically, we use the skipgram setup, where we have a target word and a context word. We made some modifications to the target functions, as there is no sense in order in a dictionary, in a JSON. And we have several different learning embedding schemes that we used. So, for example, we were interested in finding patterns inside the transactions. So in that setup, we use it as a target word, a word from the response, and as a context word, a word from the relevant transaction request. And we have different setups where we use for learning embeddings across transactions. So we use as a target word, a word from the request, and as a context word, a word from the previous request. And if we observe the learned embeddings, we can actually find interesting patterns that arise inside the clusters once we perform some sort of dimensionality reduction and clustering algorithm. So for example, in the inside transaction setup or the intra-transaction setup, we find that there's a group of fields that actually exhibit the mutual occurrence relation, which is pretty straightforward given the mechanics of word2vec. But if we look the across transaction setup, where we learn an embedding using words from different transactions inside a user session, we see that there's a specific cluster of fields that actually exhibited the mutual change relation, which is a bit less straightforward and really interesting for us once we observe this data patterns to once again monitor in real time and alert on a user session that does not adhere to these patterns. So if I summarize, we talked about APIs and how they can help you to get free pizza. We've talked about different types of data patterns in API that exist in API data that are useful for anomaly detection, and how we envision how we use an analogy to free text to find these patterns using word embedding methods. Thank you.